Between 2020 and 2023, prices of video games skyrocketed in value, leaving some to wonder if we would ever see prices stabilize, much less drop. Well, I took a look at over 20,000 price trends from 48 consoles to identify where the price boom started, possible causes, and if there's another one right around the corner. Welcome to Retronomics, the series that follows price trends in video games. For over 6 years, I have covered video game price trends to get an idea if prices will go up, down, or stay the same. And I gotta say, the past 4 years really flipped everything I knew about price trends upside down. When you're in the moment, you can't really see the forest for the trees, and now that we're approaching the 4th anniversary of the pandemic starting and prices have appeared to have stabilized, we can go back and identify key trends to see if we can't piece together just what caused the prices to spike the way that they did, and also if we can predict a future surge before it even happens. If you've been a longtime fan of the series, you'll know that I usually take 25 games from each console. It wasn't necessarily because I was lazy, but I was limited by my knowledge of how to actually get all of this data together. This year, I wanted to take Retronomics to the next level, so I took every listing from 55 consoles from PriceCharting.com and put them all together. That means that not just games, I got accessories, variants, and the systems. It's a huge undertaking, and I hope that you enjoy the video. For the sake of time and brevity, I'm only going to go over the trends on the video game market as a whole, which means that I won't cover individual console trends in this video, but they will be coming, so if you like this type of content and want to support the channel for free, like the video, share it with a friend who might find it interesting, and comment which console you want to see a breakdown of first. And also make sure that you're subscribed, because this is what I've been working on for the past 2 months, and I've got plenty more videos on the pipeline. Also, if you got a couple of bucks lying around, feel free to leave a super thanks or tip via Buy Me a Coffee. It's not necessary, but it is appreciated. We'll get into the stats in just a moment, but here's how Retronomics works. The majority of video game prices in this video come from PriceCharting.com, and each system has loose, complete in box, and sealed prices. I've been a member of the price charting community since 2015, and I've earned contributor and founding user accolades. I've also been paying for price charting's data since at least 2019. Outside of that, I don't have any affiliation with price charting. The analytics and graphics were created by me. The data that I accumulated covers about 35,000 listings across 55 consoles. The prices are between January 2020 and December 2023. I didn't include all 35,000 listings. PriceCharting.com isn't necessarily meant for Retronomics, so I had to clean up the data. I removed any listing that didn't have a price as of January 2020, which means PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series aren't included as they came out in November of 2020. Also, anything that was added by price charting after 2020, like the Evercade, Sega Pico, and the Bandai Pippin. I also removed a lot of rare, high-value games that have maybe 1 or 2 price changes a year. Metal Slug for the Neo Geo AES really threw a wrench in my analysis. That game is incredibly rare, and price charting had a listed price of $3,000. A private sale of $59,000 affected the entire dataset. Neo Geo AES prices rose a full 30% because of that one sale. I also excluded graded games, at least from PriceCharting.com. I still included graded prices, but I'll talk about those later in this video. All said and done, the grand total of my listings in my dataset from price charting is 23,968 listings across 48 consoles. I had hoped for 50 consoles, but it's enough to get a clear picture of the price trends because spread across 4 years, that's 1.15 million points of data to analyze. And that's just game prices. When I started planning this video at the beginning of the year, I wanted to see if non-video game prices had any kind of relationship. So I took a look at stimulus payment dates, used auto sale prices, Ethereum and Bitcoin prices, federal interest rate and inflation rate, and finally the stock market, particularly the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500. So with that out of the way, let's get into some price trends. We'll start broad with the growth from the start of 2020 to the end of 2023. Loose game prices started at $495,000 and ended at $721,000 for a total increase of $226,000, or about a 46% increase. CIB prices started at $940,000 and ended 2023 at $1.55 million for a total increase of $610,000, or a 65% increase. New prices started out at $1.8 million and ended at $3.6 million for a whopping increase of $1.78 million, almost double the amount in just 4 years. When you look at individual consoles, the NES, Neo Geo AES, and SNES were the three consoles whose loose prices increased the most dollar-wise. The NES and SNES also topped the CIB market too, with Game Boy close behind, which is similar to the new prices, just with a different margin. Now, dollar value is only one metric, which is why I included the percent change, and it tells a slightly different picture. GameCube, Nintendo 3DS, and Atari 7800's loose games prices increased the most percentage-wise, with only the GameCube rising over 100%. Moving to CIB, the Sega Game Gear, Game Boy Advance, and Game Boy Color all increased over 100%. New prices didn't rise as much percentage-wise as CIB, with the Game Gear rising the most, followed by the Famicom Disk System, and then the Game Boy. With those stats, you can kind of see a little bit of a trend. The NES was in the top for all three categories dollar-wise, with a lot of handhelds changing the most percentage-wise. So we know the beginning and the end. When you break it down by year, the picture starts to get a little bit clearer. Loose prices grew 12% at the end of 2020, $495,000 to $559,000, an increase of $63,000. The top three systems that changed the most were the PlayStation 2, Neo Geo AES, and the original PlayStation. When you look at the percent increase, the Famicom Disk System, GameCube, and TurboGrafx-16 round out the top three. CIB prices increased a bit more at 14%, changing from $940,000 and just crossing the $1 million mark, an increase of $131,000. Top three systems for CIB prices: the Super Nintendo, PlayStation, and the NES, and percent-wise, you got the Sega 32X increasing almost 50%, followed by the GameCube, and then the Neo Geo Pocket Color. New prices just barely eked out CIB prices by 0.28%, with a 14.28% increase from $1.8 million to $2 million, an increase of about $260,000. Top three systems for new prices were the NES, Super Nintendo, and PlayStation 2 dollar-wise, and percent change, again, the 32X increased the most, this time by 74%, followed by the Neo Geo Pocket Color and the Game Boy Color. Moving on to 2021, this is where we see some significant jumps, the most out of all 4 years. Loose prices rose 22.52% from the beginning to the end of 2021, starting at $564,000 and closing at $692,000, an increase of $127,000, which is a 39.68% increase since the start of 2020. The NES increased the most, followed by the Neo Geo AES and then the Super Nintendo. Percentage-wise, the N-Gage topped the list, followed by the Atari 5200 and then the NES. Complete in Box rose by 24%, starting 2021 at $1.08 million and ending at $1.3 million for a difference of $261,000, and that's 42.9% from the start of 2020. The NES increased the most, followed by the Super Nintendo and then the Game Boy. Percentage-wise, the Virtual Boy took the top spot at 65%, followed by the Neo Geo Pocket Color and the Philips CDI. New prices increased the most in 2021, 48%, and that's not including the jump from December 2020 to January 2021, because new prices started at $2.1 million, which is an increase of 1.4% from that month alone. 2021 ended at $3.1 million, or a 72% increase since the start of 2020. The NES's new prices grew the most from the start of 2021, followed by the Super Nintendo, and the Game Boy. When you take a look at percentage increase, Famicom Disk System increased 123%, followed by the Virtual Boy and the NES, which almost doubled. Moving on to 2022, you can see prices are starting to slow down. Loose prices only increased $39,000 or 5.57% during 2022, starting at $699,000 and ending at $738,000. But still, loose prices were 49% more than what they were at the start of 2020. The Atari 2600 increased the most, followed by the Neo Geo AES and then the NES. Percentage-wise, it was all CD-based consoles. TurboGrafx CD increasing 46%, Neo Geo CD, and the Philips CDI. CIB prices increased 3 times more than the loose prices, but only 11.67% when compared against the sum for the entire year, increasing $160,000, which is 62.33% compared to the start of 2020. Systems that increased the most? Game Boy, NES, and Super Nintendo, but when you compare percent increase, the Sega, Game Gear, Game Boy, and 3DO increased the most, with the Game Gear increasing 57% in 2022. New prices only increased 1.5 times more than CIB prices, increasing $399,000 or 12.52% in 2022. For those keeping score at home, we're at 96.9% increase since the start of 2020. The top 3 new prices were Game Boy, Super Nintendo, and the NES. Percentage-wise, the Game Boy increased 39.47%, followed by the Game Gear and the Game & Watch. And finally, 2023, where prices really struggled to grow. Actually, 2 out of the 3 categories dropped in value this year. Loose prices decreased almost 3%, dropping $22,000 of market value. Of course, like I mentioned at the top of the video, they still increased 46% overall. The Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PlayStation 2 rounded out the top 3. Percentage-wise, the original Xbox's loose prices increased the most, followed by the Atari 7800 and the Xbox 360. Moving on to CIB prices, they barely rose at all, $8,300 or 0.54% in 2023, making the final increase from 2020 65%. Top system was, of course, the NES, followed by the Game & Watch, and then the Game Boy Advance. Percentage-wise, the Famicom Disk System increased 70%, followed by the Game & Watch and the Neo Geo Pocket Color. When you look at the new prices, they dropped, well, technically, $6,200, which is 0.17% of the total market cap, so almost no change. But prices are still twice as high as what they were at the start of 2020. Game & Watch increased the most, followed by Atari 2600 and then the Game Boy Advance. Percent-wise, Game & Watch increased 35%, followed by the Neo Geo Pocket Color and the Sega Game Gear. Now, when you drill down month to month, alright, I'm not going to go over each individual month, but I did identify 4 specific instances where video game trends changed significantly. April 2020, March 2021, October 2021, and January 2022. April 2020 is the obvious one, the first full month of social restrictions in the majority of the United States and a month after the first stimulus check of $1,400. And the Fed was all like,
"I've got something for you."
And the economy went,
"Oh, look at those low rates."
The Dow Jones, Bitcoin, and Ethereum were also rebounding after a huge drop-off back in March. Video game prices reacted as well. April 2020 was the first month where prices rose significantly from the previous month. Loose 2.6%, CIB 2.27%, and new 1.38%. The top systems that changed in 2020 were the NES for loose, Super Nintendo for CIB, and PlayStation 4 for new. And it makes sense, people are stuck indoors and some are fortunate enough to be able to spend those $1,400 extra on whatever they want, so why not video games? This is further illustrated by the percent change. The Wii increased 10 and 16% in the loose and CIB categories, while the Wii U increased the most in the new category. Prices would peak in May, then less in June and July. New prices would bump 4% in August, then level off like the rest of the prices, increasing 1% or less for the rest of the year. As social restrictions started being relaxed and video game conventions announcing that they would return in 2021, it did appear that the prices were returning to how they behaved before 2020. But that lull was short-lived, as 2021 would impact prices way more, with sealed prices increasing 2.6% in March, then 4.2% over that in April. The Nintendo 64, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy Advance rounded out the top three, with the Nintendo 64, Game Boy Advance, and PlayStation Vita increasing the most percentage-wise. Then, loose and complete in-box prices would increase in April, with loose prices increasing 3.5%. The NES, Super NES, and Game Boy Advance increased the most dollar-wise, while the Virtual Boy, Famicom Disk System, and Nintendo 64 increased the most percentage-wise. Complete in-box prices would rise 4.5%, with the PlayStation, NES, and Super Nintendo increasing the most dollar-wise, and the PlayStation, Sega Dreamcast, and GameCube rounding out the top 3% increases. So what was happening during this time? Well, most of us got another stimulus check of $1,600. Tax season was also in play, so a lot of people had refunds to spend on something fun. Interest rates were also historically low, which led to used car markets to start to climb, as it was clear that auto manufacturers couldn't keep up with the demand after suspending their manufacturing last year. As the Dow Jones and S&P had recovered from a significant dip in January, inflation started to creep its ugly head, rising to 2.6% in March over last year, and then just kept climbing as the year went on. But the real star of the show was crypto. Bitcoin and Ethereum had climbed alongside the great GameStop squeeze in January, but Ethereum and Bitcoin reached their first peak of the year in March. NFTs going for millions, it was like money wasn't even real. Which leads me to October 2021. Everything was reaching record levels. Dow Jones over 35,000, S&P 4,400, Bitcoin 61,000, Ethereum 4,400, inflation 6.2% with no sign of slowing down. And interest rates rock bottom, which meant that the average used car prices were at the highest they've been since the start of 2020. And video games, highest increases so far, which peaked in November. Loose prices increased $37,000 or 5.75%. The Neo Geo AES, Atari 2600, and the NES increased the most on the dollar side, while the N-Gage, Neo Geo AES, and Atari 2600 increased the most percentage-wise. CIB prices increased even more. Almost $60,000 increased over October from the previous month, 4.72%. The top three, Atari 2600, NES, and Game Boy for the dollar change, and then Sega Game Gear, Atari 5200, and Neo Geo Pocket Color increased the most percentage-wise. But by far, new prices increased the most, and it was the highest they increased the entire boom, $380,000, more than CIB and loose combined. Same with the percentage increase at 15%. NES, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy were in the top $3 increases, and Sega Game Gear, Atari 5200, and 3DO increased the most percentage-wise. So you gotta ask yourself, could prices go any higher? Well, yeah. While prices did settle in December and January, they would pick right back up in February of 2022. And for loose and CIB prices, they would have their highest peaks of the boom. New prices also spiked, just not as much as they did back in November. Loose game prices increased just under $80,000 or 11.43%, with the PlayStation, PlayStation 2, and Neo Geo AES rounding out the top $3 increases. Sega Saturn, Dreamcast, and PlayStation would increase the most percentage-wise. In fact, 4 out of the top 5 spots were occupied by PlayStation consoles, which suggests that the spike was related to the rumor that the PlayStation 5 would be fully backwards compatible, and that rumor started in January. It was announced in March that legacy titles would be playable via subscription, which caused a correction around the same time. More detail will come on that during the PlayStation details, so just be patient. CIB prices increased $70,000 or 5.14% from the previous month, with the Super NES, Nintendo 64, and NES taking the top 3 spots. Percentage-wise, the Nintendo 64, TurboGrafx 16, and 3DO were in the top 3. While the new prices increased $131,000 or 4.12%, it's just over half of the increase that we saw back in November. The NES, N64, and Sega Genesis were at the top dollar-wise, and the Atari Lynx, Famicom Disk System, and the N64 rounded out the top 3 percentage-wise. Unlike November and previous spikes, the Dow Jones had started to tumble from its peak in December of 2021. The same thing happened with the S&P 500. And this is mainly because the Fed had finally signaled that they were going to start raising interest rates to fight inflation, which had climbed to 7% in December with no signs of slowing down. Used car prices had also started to level off as manufacturers started meeting demand, and it was no longer as good of a deal to pay the insane markup at the current loan rates. Bitcoin and Ethereum did dip as well in December and January, but started to pick up in February and peaked in March, only to plummet over the next 3 months. Ethereum fell 25% and Bitcoin almost 70% from their peaks in October and November respectively. February 2022 would mark the last time that video game prices would show a significant increase in growth, and over the next year and a half would fall back down to what it was before March of 2020. Now, that doesn't mean that prices decreased overall. Like I said at the beginning of the video, prices climbed 46, 65, and over 100% in the respective price categories. When I go over each individual console in later videos, we'll identify games that increased or decreased the most over the past 4 years. Alright, let's talk about graded games. Oh wait. Okay, that's better. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, graded games. Now, I didn't include graded games in my original data set because it's not that they don't matter, they absolutely do, it's just that they're an entirely different category of price tracking. For starters, you can grade anything in any condition, loose, complete, sealed, it doesn't matter. After you figure that out, you then need to consider the variant of which game that you're dealing with. Legend of Zelda, for example, has 9 variations. If you include them all, you need to consider the grade that each variant gets. Oh, and each graded company has their own grading scale. Add the fact that there are significantly less graded sales to get a real idea of actual trends, you can see how messy it can get when you try to include it with the previous dataset. Speaking of messy, here's what they look like from pricecharting.com. Yikes. I do plan on making a dedicated video on this topic that dives into those details, but I at least wanted to include something on the topic in this video. So I first took a look at the top most expensive graded games, and then I added a couple that I thought that were interesting. I came away with 13 games, and the prices are from gamerstonks.com, which aggregates from different auction houses and grading companies. When you count the individual sales regardless of variant or grade, you can see that most of the sales occurred in 2022. The headline grabbing sales happened in July of 2021. Super Mario 64 selling for $1.5 million and Legend of Zelda selling for $870,000. But when you set the threshold of sales to $25,000 or more, 2020 had 8 sales, 2021 had 58, 2022 had 75, and 2023 had 25, but 2019 didn't have any. On the surface, it doesn't appear that there were any spikes in the graded prices correlating with the rest of my dataset, but you also have to consider that these are auction sales which occurred at set times, unlike non-graded games which are sold any time of the day. It does show that the sale prices of high dollar games had slowed down around the same time as other video game prices, so more research is required. I only have 13 games and 877 sales, but I really want to see where the relationship between graded and non-graded price trends in, but I do really think that that's one of the reasons why NES is at the top in so many of my spikes. So stay tuned for a more detailed video and let me know what games I should include in it. I think it's clear after calculating the data that there were three main contributors affecting the overall game market these past 4 years. People stuck in their homes looking for entertainment that couldn't get their hands on the current gen systems like the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series. Speculators who saw the graded auction headlines and wanted to buy video games as a tangible asset to fight inflation and maybe invest money into an emerging market. Maybe they took advantage of the ridiculously low interest rates to buy in as a group. And collectors who had a sudden infusion of cash from crypto or retail stocks or the stimulus checks and could finally buy what they wanted. Of course, these aren't the only factors. Perhaps you were a game collector stuck at home and saw how expensive video games were becoming, so you bought hoping to get in before they got too expensive. Or you were a wealthy collector from another hobby like baseball cards or comics who wanted to start collecting video games. Or you were a long-time collector who saw the boom and decided to sell off some of your stuff to either retire or because you wanted to collect something else. There are a lot of collectors out there who were able to buy sealed NES games on clearance by the box full. I sold some of my collection as well to clear up some space and to fund some equipment for this channel. While stimulus checks, tax season, and people stuck inside most likely bumped the prices of April 2020, by the end of 2020 restrictions were relaxed, so casual players either sold off what they bought at the beginning of March or they just stopped buying altogether. Remember, in 2020, market growth had peaked in June and started to return back to pre-pandemic levels. Prices were still growing, but just not exponentially like at the start of the pandemic. 2021, where prices increased the most, appear to have been caused by the hysteria of crypto and retail stocks absolutely exploding in value. Seriously, if you just put $1,000 in Bitcoin in September of 2020, you'd have 6 times that at its peak in October of 2021. But what happens when you take that hype away? Does crypto affect video game prices? Well, all the dates I mentioned in this video had a crypto bump, including new prices in August of 2020, but correlation doesn't equal causation. If you go back even further to Bitcoin's first significant spike in 2017, which had its first bump in April to May, CIB and used prices barely rose at all, but new prices rose 4.76% in June, and when Bitcoin rose another 80% in August, new prices jumped in September 3.26%. They would correct in December through January and then not be affected by the rest of Bitcoin's change for the next few months until April 2018, but only rising enough to be considered typical. CIB prices did raise 3.78% though. When you look at the June 2019 Bitcoin spike, new CIB and used prices barely rose at all. CIB prices did bump 2.87% in May, and Bitcoin had also increased 58%, but I think we can say it's just an interesting observation. Some might even say a theory. That's why it's reasonable to assume that the crypto boom combined with the insanely low interest rates and inflation fears caused a perfect storm of hoopla that just didn't drive video game prices. It drove up the cost of almost every tangible asset. Used cars, houses, Pokemon cards, graded games, NFTs. If there was a competing market for it, chances are prices increased and decreased around the same time as video game prices, some dropping way more than others. RIP Bored Apes and all those meme coins. The theory is reinforced when you consider the consistency of the consoles at the top of each peak. But we'll have to keep an eye on the current crypto boom to see if there's any increase, especially with the interest rate back to what it was in 2006 and inflation around 3%. I only have January and February to work with at the moment, but I do see an increase from month to month, but I need more data to get a bigger picture. Now I guess is the best time to announce that I will be making a Retronomics quarterly report video in May once I have March's complete data, so let me know what kind of questions you have about the video game market and I'll try to answer them. But that's just overall game market trends. While the GameCube and other systems I covered in Retronomics increased, they weren't the significant driver of the video game prices. When we start going through each individual system, we can then get a more detailed picture of the price boom and identify which systems increased when, and why, and also point out some games that increased the most. So that's gonna do it for this video. I hope you found it interesting because I had a lot of fun making it and I really learned a lot about how to measure price trends. If you made it to the end and you're somehow not subscribed, do me a favor and do that now because I got a lot more videos just like this one in the pipeline. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Nicktendo. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Nick and I'll see you next time.